This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek Podcast with Living the Wildlife Podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, bringing you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek Podcast family. Glad to have you on board. I hope you've had a good week. And so I've had a not bad of a week. I was doing some research on Richardson ground squirrels fumigating with a Burrow RX machine. So that process has been starting, and I'll probably talk about that down the road. Do take a few moments, if you would, to subscribe to the channel and make sure you ring the bell, and also so that you can get updates on new publications or broadcasts that we do. I publish about once a week. So, and again, my specialty, of course, is vertebrate pest control, but we're glad to have you on board here. We would love to have feedback from you. If you have topics that you would like to have covered, definitely reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Love to hear your thoughts, criticisms, and suggestions for the show. If you have products or ideas you'd like to get marketed out there to the world, I'd love to interview you. Always interested in learning about new techniques and ideas that are created in our industry, so definitely reach out to me. I'd love to interview you for a show and get your stuff out there. Today, thought I would talk about swallows. Swallows is a big problem for many people across the country, and they can be kind of difficult. So I thought, given that this is the spring and people, you may be getting some calls on this. So it seems that we have some building of nests around here in Montana, so I would be confident maybe that's occurring elsewhere as well. So why don't we get started straight away here? Well, my machine's kind of froze up. There we go. All right. So, of course, the problem is the nesting, right? So these are cliff swallows. Cliff swallows kind of create these little tubular type nests where they can go inside, where the barn swallow creates sort of more of a platform type nest. So both species can be an issue, but the research that I came across dealt with cliff swallows. So I want to be sure that we're just talking just cliff swallows here, but I do think the information from this particular research is useful for barn swallows, but I could be wrong. So let's find, but I thought I would make you aware of it, and this was published a while ago, and I'm going to be talking about some of their findings. Legalities, we've got to keep that, of course, in mind. Cliff swallows and barn swallows are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and so you can't just simply shoot them because you feel like it. You can't trap them because you feel like it. They cannot be harmed in any way. They can't be taken in any way. So that's a violation of the federal treaty that we have with other countries there. And that's to protect birds that migrate out of our country and cross national borders, of course. You may also have additional regulations based on your location, whether it's a province or state or district. There may be additional requirements. So even if you get a permit to use lethal control on these birds, you may have state and possibly local, although I doubt that's going to be the case for most of you. You may have some state permitting that you also need to encompass. Some states just simply accept the federal permit and they go and do your thing. Other states require an additional permit that they must issue. And remember, the cost of these permits for a homeowner is $100. I think for businesses, it's $200. So you want to be trying some other things before you start applying that, because there's no guarantee you'll get permission to use lethal control. So what does can't harm mean? It means you cannot harm the birds directly. You cannot take the bird in your possession, and you cannot disturb the birds when they have active nests. Now, an active nest would be eggs, the presence of eggs, or the presence of chicks. So once the nest has been abandoned, Or if the nest, I guess, has not been complete, you can remove the nest. In other words, if you want to just keep scraping it down, because it takes them a little while to build them, you could keep doing that because that's sort of harassing. You can haze these birds, but you can't do this when they have eggs or chicks. And by the way, hazing birds when they have young is really cruel because they're not going to want to abandon their young. And so once the egg is laid, the hazing needs to stop. I mean, it's no longer appropriate, and it's really unethical in a variety of ways. So don't do that. So you want to be doing this work before the nests are built, and of course clients rarely ever do that, right? So I mean, that's just the reality of it, but this is something you need to be thinking about for future issues, of course. So the damage, not just to mention the mud nests as they exist, but also the droppings. The droppings you're seeing here are not from cliff swallows, they are from barn swallows, but poo is poo. A lot of people don't want this because these nests occur next to structures, and they can get in the way of foot traffic and that sort of thing, and they can just be kind of disgusting for some people, and so clearly that is an issue. The range of these birds is actually expanded according to the website I consulted. It talked about how with the rise of more human construction across the United States, that the swallows have left their range primarily in the west and began to move out into the Great Plains and elsewhere. Of course, we've provided them lots of structures where they mimic the cliffs, of course, and bridges can mimic a cliff, large structures can mimic cliffs, and the birds are like, well, hey, I'll build a nest here. And so they've expanded their range dramatically, and you can see this map that shows their migration. They travel some pretty impressive distances, so that's rather striking. So the research I'm going to talk to you about today has been an article that was published back in 2009, and I'll read that for those of you who are just riding along in your vehicle. So it is written by Jacqueline S. Conklin, Michael J. Delwish, W. Paul Gorenzel, and Robert W. Coates. And the title of the piece is Deterring Cliff Swallow Nesting on Highway Structures Using Bioacoustics and Surface Modifications. And it was published in Human Wildlife Conflicts, Volume 3, Edition 1, pages 93 through 102 in the spring of 2009. So just to kind of give that title for you again, Deterring Cliff Swallow Nesting on Highway Structures Using Bioacoustics and Surface Modifications. So that is what this presentation is based on. So it's not my research, and I don't want you to think that it is. I'm simply sort of abstracting this information for you and kind of bottom lining it so that you don't have to read the article yourself, and I'll give some thoughts and commentary on that. So what did these folks do? So what they did was they realized that cliff swallows on bridges is a big problem. Those of you who live in cliff swallow areas know this is a significant issue. And it can interfere, their presence can interfere with certain construction activities because, again, they're a protected species, right? So you can't just simply willy-nilly do things to them like you could, let's say, a mouse, right? So it becomes an issue. And so what they tried was, can there be ways to deter these birds from nesting on certain structures using frightening devices, in this particular case, audible frightening devices. So that's where the bioacoustic, and so what they used was cliff swallow alarm call, and they used cliff swallow distress calls. And they got these recordings and put them onto, I'm going to call it, for lack of a better word, basically a coyote caller type device that could emanate these calls in sort of a randomized fashion, and it would just simply constantly blast along. Now, where did they get these calls from? A lot of people, we're not out there with microphones trying to get these calls. So the sources of these frightening sounds was from the Macaulay Library of Natural Sounds at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Ithaca, New York. That was one source. The other source was the Borer Laboratory of Bioacoustics, and Borer is spelled B-O-R-R-O-R. That's B-O-R-R-O-R, Borer Laboratory of Bioacoustics, Ohio State University, Columbus, Ohio. And that's where they purchased these calls, and then they put them onto these recordings with speakers to be able to direct that sound up at the base, at those bridges. Now, what were the sounds that they used? And so they used a total of 8 sounds, of which some of them were put into sort of a mix. And so I will read these out. It's a little detailed for those of you who are riding along. It may sound a bit tedious, but you'll get the idea. And they used 8 of these. And so you can certainly go back online and be able to read these specifically if you're not able to jot them down from where you are. Don't do anything dangerous while you're driving, to be sure, right? So don't do that. So the first one was the cliff swallow distress call, and that was the LNS-8077. The second one was multiple cliff swallow alarm calls, the BLB 28435. Now those letters refer to which company they got the sounds from. Like the Borer Lab is the BLB, and the one from Cornell University is the LNS. Okay, so the third one was the colony of cliff swallows giving alarm calls, and that was from the Cornell Institute. 118832 is the number. The fourth one is colony of cliff swallows giving multiple calls, and that's from the Cornell location, 118832, plus 2 cliff swallow alarm call sequences, which is also from Cornell, and that's 73817. The fifth one was cliff swallow distress call with alarm calls in background. That was from Cornell at 8077. And then they had 4 calls in the foreground and 2 distant alarm calls, and that was the Cornell 105668. The sixth set was the colony of cliff swallows giving multiple alarm calls, and that was Cornell 118832. And the LNS, that's Cornell again, 41138. The seventh one was colony of cliff swallows giving multiple alarm calls, and that was the Cornell 118832, plus individual cliff swallows giving alarm calls, Cornell 104564. And the last set was 1 to 2 cliff swallows giving alarm calls flying by and flying away, and that was Cornell again at 111063. So yeah, a lot of really technical data there, but I wanted to be sure you had that if you were looking to try out some of these distress calls. It would give you something to play with, because I know some of you guys out there are pretty creative, and this will give you something that some of you who are a little bit more techie perhaps, and you might want to try that out on your own calling system. Now the second thing that they tried was not just using frightening and distress calls, and let me back up a moment. So why did they use distress calls and alarm calls? Well, the theory is you all know that whenever you're using just sort of like a predator call or something, that birds habituate to these calls. A lot of animals, wildlife, when they're constantly being bombarded with a particular sound, they learn to tune it out, just like we do. If we have some noise, let's say the neighbor's hammering something, we can learn after a while just to tune that out. We just learn to ignore it. Well, birds will do the same thing. And so by using alarm calls and distress calls, that is like hardwired into those animals. So it takes a lot more effort for a bird to neglect and ignore something that's hardwired into them. So think of it like when you hear a screaming baby, it is really hard to ignore the sound of a screaming baby, right? It's almost like it's wired into us that we got to do something to put a stop to it. If you've ever been on a plane with a screaming baby, you can know just how emotionally traumatizing it can feel at times. You're just like, can we do anything to make it stop? And that's what it will feel for these birds. And so whenever possible, if you're going to use audible frightening devices, always try to use bioacoustics. That is, sounds of distress and fear that's hardwired into the animal itself. And so that's where that came from. So they wanted to try that, and they wanted to try surface coatings to if the birds can't stick the mud against the surface to create their nest, they can't create a nest. In other words, if they can't adhere it, then they can't build it. So what they tried was polyethylene sheeting. This was high density polyethylene sheeting, and they used 150 meter rolls, 0.51 millimeters thick, 38 centimeters wide. And so a centimeter is about a little less than about half an inch. So you're looking at something probably 28 inches or so, maybe 24 inches. And then they purchased this from Plastics International, located in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And they helped adhere this to surfaces using a butyl-based sealant tape called Panlastic bead sealant with nylon cubes. And that was produced by Butler Manufacturing Company in Kansas City. And so they wanted to try both of these, both an audible distress and frightening, as well as a surface protection, and to see how these would work to prevent cliff swallow nesting on bridges. Here are their results. Now, the control is the bridges that they didn't do anything with. In other words, they just simply said, here's a bridge, we're not going to treat this bridge with anything. How many cliff swallows will nest there? On the control bridges, the average was 181 nests. On the bridges where they used sound only, that's the audible frightening device, those bridges averaged 85 nests. And if you look at the chart, and those of you able to see it, you'll notice that over time, the number of nests increased. So it showed that the birds were becoming habituated to the audible distress sounds and the frightening calls, distress calls. When they use the sheeting only, that's the surface treatment with that polyethylene coating, those bridges had an average of only 56 nests, so that's significantly less. So when we compare the sheeting only with the control, the sheeting only had a third of the nests of the control. So that is pretty significant. Now, it's not proof. Now, I know a lot of your clients are not going to want, well, I don't want to have 30 nests on my house instead of 100. I want to have 0 nests. Okay, well, that's a problem, right? So, but that's not always possible. And maybe you have clients who can say, I can tolerate some nesting, but I'd like to have it reduced. And so sheeting only got it down to basically 1/3 of the amount of the control. So that's pretty impressive. So a 70, probably a 70% level of control, that's pretty impressive. The sound and sheeting combined, when you use the audible distress and audible and alarm calls, coupled with the surface treatment, that reduced the average down to 31 nests. So basically probably about an 85% level of control. Again, not perfect, but substantial. Okay. Now, you may say, well, Stephen, why do I want to do all that? Let me just net. Well, absolutely. If you can net the birds to keep them away from building, that is the platinum standard. By all means, go for it. I'm not telling you that this is the Shangri-La here. I'm trying to give you another option for those situations and clients that just don't want to go the netting route. They don't want to be calling you every year to reinstall the net. They don't want to be putting it up themselves. They don't want to store it. They just don't want it. Here is another option, but you need to be clear with your client. This is not going to be perfect. Now, your client may get perfection, but you can't guarantee it until we get more data from the field. So I'm just wanting to put this out there. So what are some issues? I've already mentioned some birds did show habituation to the sounds over time. They learned to ignore them. And the suggestion of the authors of this paper was that they think that if you used a motion activated distress call rather than one that was simply on a loop, it would have a longer effect. And I think that certainly makes sense. If you're just hearing a sound constantly, no matter what, that is going to certainly lose its efficacy over time because you're going to learn to ignore it. However, every time you move into the area, the distress sound emerges, well, then that's going to definitely be much more startling, and you're not going to habituate as quickly. So that was the suggestion of the authors, and I would certainly think that is a reasonable suggestion. Concluding thoughts. They looked into using Teflon surface coatings, but they were too expensive. And so this is my thought here. This is not from the journal article, and I'm not suggesting that it is. I'm simply throwing it out there as perhaps something for those of you that are struggling with cliff swallows, that this is something you may want to do a little bit of experiment. Be open with your client, be honest with your client, say, look, I want to try something out. Is it okay for me to give this a whirl? And it might be enough to discourage the bird to go to the neighbor's house. Okay. Remember, a lot of times when we do things as wildlife control operators, we don't have to necessarily we don't have to be perfect sometimes. Sometimes we just have to make it difficult enough for the animal to stay at point A to convince them to move to point B. And so they can move over to the neighbor's house. And so this is something I'm throwing out here as a suggestion for the industry to consider, and perhaps you may want to try in your own industry. And the thought I'm having is, would Teflon-based paint work? So this is something different than adding a plastic sheeting to the surface of the structure. This is where we're just simply painting the surface with a Teflon-based paint, so you can have maybe the level of smoothness and hardness necessary so that the birds can't secure the mud against the building. If they can't secure the mud for their nest against the building, they can't build the nest. I just throw it out there for you to look at. I have some links down here at the bottom. You can certainly do a Google search on Teflon.com. Teflon is a brand name product, of course. It is a very slippery surface. It's a very hard surface. And there are paints that have Teflon in it, and will those work to help reduce nest building on structures? I don't know, and I would love to get your comments and thoughts on this, because it certainly sounds reasonable, but we don't know until we try. And I think that this could be something that could give some relief for those of you out there with clients who are struggling with this problem, and perhaps be a profit center for you. And I certainly hope that it would be a win-win for everyone concerned. So something definitely to check out. I hope you found that helpful. If not, something to think about for your business if you're encountering cliff swallows, because we are getting into nesting season for cliff swallows. So perhaps this is something you can use. Again, to conclude, I'm Stephen Vantassel. I'm the host of Living the Wildlife, and I'm really glad that you've participated in today's and listening to today's broadcast. Would love to have you subscribe to the channel, and definitely reach out to me. You can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. That's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your comments, questions, thoughts, criticisms. Yes, even indeed criticisms. Would love to hear it. Again, that's wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. You can always visit my website, and of course I have some publications if you're looking to expand. Always looking for opportunities to do some ghostwriting for people, doing some research for you, and even some training and some other things. Definitely reach out to me. I would love to hear what some of your concerns and thoughts are, and we could definitely chat along. I'm also looking for house mouse scat. So if you have access to house mouse, not deer mouse, house mouse scat, I'm looking to purchase some of that. I just need to have it dried. Whether it's been treated, whether the mouse has eaten toxicant or not, it doesn't matter to me. I'm interested in both, but I'm looking for those who are willing to send me some house mouse scat that they can confirm, because I need some of those samples. And again, you can reach me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. All right, enough of that. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why? Because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.